other than the politics and the increase in Corona, Israel's, I think they're about 19 years old, Israel's youth soccer team won the European semi-final yesterday in Slovakia, beating what was undefeated France. So now, for the first time, it's going on
really cute,
to the final against England. So this is something major because, Israel's just a small, weaker team. So what do you think, in the spirit of this class, where we are constantly looking at our sources, what do you think was the pep talk that the Israeli coach gave our team as they are afraid of France, but they beat them, and now to go on to England, which they lost to, I think, last week, but they might win this time. What was the pep talk from the Tanakh? Come on. This little team is going up against
David and Goliath.
David and Goliath.
I was unmuted.
Right. That's one of the things I love most, how something that has perhaps very little to do with tradition, even though everything does, but and secular, whether it's a TV show, a song, find its source so often in our sources. So we wish them luck on Friday playing England. I have no idea what time that game is being played. But it doesn't matter. Let them enjoy and let them win.
They will lose.
Okay.
Bracha, you know how I feel.
Who just said that?
You said that.
Who just
The
said that?
realist. The realist.
Oh, Nechama. Oh, no.
No,
Okay.
Bracha, generally, when it comes to sport, the
Yes.
difference between ignorance and apathy. I don't know and I don't care.
Mhm.
But this time I do because it's Israel.
Yes, I get you. But sports and spirit is a very, very important thing. Now I'm going to ask you, as we continue on our exploration of the Jewish attitude to a few emotions, if I were to tell you that we only had time today to talk about either anxiety or anger, which one would you choose for us to focus on? We're going to discuss both, but I'm just curious because it will indicate something.
But aren't they related? Because
Of course they're related, but we're discussing them as two different topics. So nothing complicated about my question. Which one would it be?
I say anxiety.
I agree.
I go with anxiety
as well.
Okay, so now the next question is going to be, why anxiety as opposed to anger? That's the bigger concern these days?
Can you control anger better than you can control anxiety?
Ah,
And I believe that anxiety actually is more prevalent than we know it is, and is affecting more people today than it ever was,
absolutely, absolutely.
including our children.
Absolutely.
Would you like to share more, Marlene? No, absolutely.
No, I mean,
But I think we're always surprised sometimes when you assume that you're the only one with this anxiety, and then you find out, very matter-of-factly, that 5 other people that you know are suffering, if not from that particular, but something else. Absolutely.
and they have found that there actually is a genetic component within anxiety, and that it does manifest itself in families from one generation to the other.
I agree.
Okay, but hopefully with each
Yeah.
generation, perhaps more can be done about it in certain ways. Okay,
But
all right,
people
so
who suffer from anxiety go for professional help.
yeah. Okay, we're going to dive in, first talking about anxiety. Now, I'm going to ask you a question about this short text from Sefer Breshit, creation. Pay attention to the details. In the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, so God separated the light from the darkness. And it was evening, and it was morning, one day. Tell us, what are at least 3 things we see in this text?
The importance of light.
Okay, yes. But now I'm actually asking for some very specific textual without philosophizing about it. Factual, according to the text.
Light is good.
Okay, we see that light is good. Let's go back to the beginning.
In the beginning, the earth was without form and was empty, and darkness was all around us.
Okay, so darkness was before the light. Yes, Sipora?
I just want to say that one of the elements there is the separation between light and dark and evening and morning. It's a havdalah.
Okay, all right, good. So let's put these together. Darkness preceded light, and you should already be beginning to think of why I have brought these psukim. And in order for light to exist, it had to be created. It didn't just happen. It didn't exist on its own. And even when light was created, it was still mixed with darkness. And as Tzipora just said, it had to be separated from it. Now, something else.
Bracha, God did not eliminate darkness. It means that darkness is part of life.
Yeah, nobody said that he eliminated darkness. We're just saying darkness, as happens in our day, and notice day isn't just sunlight. The word for yom is the 24-hour period. And we know, as confusing as it is, that our days begin at night, right? Shabbat begins Friday night. Very confusing, very confusing. But there's a message in that darkness before the light.
Because
and every day, every 24-hour period can only be complete when it includes both the darkness, evening, and the light of morning and afternoon.
Bracha, that
Yes.
reminds me of Plato and in the Republic when he talks about you have to go through the cave to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly. We bring this as an introduction that would it be nice if it was always light and bright? But that's not reality. But intentionally, we are told, God had the darkness come first, hoping that we would always be able to go from there to the light. But we adults know that nighttime will come again. Nighttime will come again. Now, is this too optimistic, me saying that light will come after dark? Is there something beneficial about these psukim and the message that we know that before dawn it can be the darkest? Do you find that beneficial in thinking like that? Or is it purely
But isn't the whole Jewish thought is hope? At Tikvah, when things are dark, you always hope that things will get better.
Yes, we do. Or otherwise we would not be here or perhaps anywhere. Now, perhaps you've heard, he just died last year, a Dr. Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky. He's a psychiatrist, and his focus was people with addictions. And he says the following, as he tries to give us his take on confronting anxiety. In our society, we are so accustomed to avoiding darkness with night lights for our children to ward away monsters and televisions blaring at night to fill the silence, that we forget that darkness is not only inevitable, but that it can be a powerful and holy place as well. It is where Jacob meets the angel and where Moshe comes to face with God. And while there may be monsters of one form or another in the darkness, it is only through confronting them that we can truly dispel their power. He goes on to say that actually times of stress are also times that are signals for growth. If we use adversity properly, we can grow through adversity. He is very much being a realist. And again, I'm not sure he would go looking for darkness and adversity, but you don't have to look too far to see it. And so instead of perhaps being overly protective, you have to realize you're going to be exposed and experience at whatever age and find a way to deal with it. Anybody else want to comment on what he has said here?
But what I take from it is that hard times makes us strong. We learn from our tough experiences, and this is part of strength of growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Well, it's very nice in theory. It sounds good. I'd like to believe it, but when you're actually going through it, I think it's not so easy to feel that way.
That's a very good point, Linda. He suggests, I don't have that here, that we should be preparing ourselves, that if you build up a certain attitude, you'll be prepared as much as one can be prepared for a difficult time. Absolutely. Of course. Yes.
Maybe a small example. Last week I went to play cards, and when I came out, somebody scratched my car. And my reaction was, it's only plastic. 10 years ago, I would have been upset and angry. Today, I look at it and I said, it's only plastic. I don't care.
You must have won at that card game.
No, actually I did, but that's not the point.
Okay, no, it isn't the point. It isn't the point, but what you're saying is very true. We have different perspectives at different ages, and because of different experiences, it's only material and it can be fixed, and thank God nobody was hurt. Now, Twersky fears, though, that many, when dealing with anxiety, act as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai. What episode am I referring to? When Moshe goes up Har Sinai to get those wonderful tablets. And it says, text 3, when the people saw that Moshe was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aaron and said to him, come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that man Moshe, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. So what does Twersky see is happening here with Bnei Israel, the Israelites? He says, because they're anxious, and they have a right to be anxious after all they've gone through, and they've put so much faith in Moshe, even though he's just a representative of God, he feels that people tend to not really deal with their anxiety, but will get busy with other things that really aren't going to be helpful. They're just going to be a distraction. What gods are we in danger of making during a time of uncertainty? We've had a period of 2 years, if we want to focus on this uncertainty. Have you noticed that people, in order to cope, have been creating what Twersky and I are calling gods? You know, putting so much into that in order to survive. Anyone? Whether you yourself had to find something and maybe went overboard with it, or have you noticed others?
Well, I've learned something very important, that I can live with myself.
Okay, that is very important. That is very important.
I think
Arlene?
I think what we've seen is there's a few things that have happened. Number one, I mean, if you look out into the world, the use of the amount of substance abuse has gone up. I mean, we're really in a far greater opioid crisis than we were before. And the other thing that I think that has happened with many people is that they've turned very much inward and have lost their ability in many cases to relate to other people. I will tell you that when I was working in the elections,
Yes.
I saw that working relationships have to be rebuilt for many of these people because they've been alone for so long that they've forgotten how to relate in outside circumstances.
But you know what?
Very interesting.
What I
Very
find
interesting.
very interesting is watching my little ones. They are paying a much higher price than the adults because the social contact in school is so important to them that we still don't know what the price will really be.
Yes, people have commented about that repeatedly as well.
And you know,
And that's why, at least in Israel, when they were debating, should the schools open, should they not? So you would have specialists saying, you know, the emotional side can be as important as the physical health. And it's
you know, my daughter
difficult.
who is a pediatric physician says that the number of teenagers who try to commit suicide in that period is way out the chart.
Yeah.
Bracha, I'm
Yes.
just wondering if you're also referring to the fact that people have turned to the medical community and to the political communities for answers to their lives.
Do you want to say more about that? That sounds interesting.
Well, just that, you know, when we don't know how to behave and we're looking for answers, the scientific community's been very divided and unclear, but people are holding it up as a model for how we should, they're still searching, and we look to them, which is a natural thing, but it's not the only thing. And that's true about the political. You look to your leaders, but they don't always have the answers.
No, they don't. But I think I wasn't really referring to that. I think that's another, because of anxiety, that people are hoping that the medical field, we want to put trust in them, you know, and that's why it's so frustrating when one day they say one thing and the next month they say something else, because you want to believe what they're saying. And of course, the politicians, but you'd like to believe that, at least in the physicians, they're not playing politics. But I think we find out that somehow that also becomes political. Let's look at some further advice for anxiety that the Tanakh, the Bible, gives us. So if we look at Mishlei, there's a pasuk there that says, if there is anxiety, yashchena, in a man's mind, let him quash it and turn it into joy with a good word. Now, that's advice, you know, not necessarily to deal with it, but put it behind you and even go listen to somebody tell you a joke. Now, very interesting, the word play often in Hebrew words, perhaps mostly in the Tanakh. This word that I have in bold, yashchena, depending on how you read it, has three different meanings. So we could read it and say, if there is anxiety, suppress it. Or another way of understanding the word is, if there is anxiety, ignore it. If you read it not yash, but with a sin. Then, what is one of the words for discussion in Hebrew?
Sicha.
Sicha, exactly. So if you also say yaschena, a third way of dealing with it is to articulate the anxiety. Okay, so we go from suppressing, and there isn't that much of a difference between suppressing and ignoring, to actually talking about it. Now, why do you suppress?
Bracha, but there is one more way. You can say
Yes.
the milah shchicha, to forget, like forget it.
You know what?
I take shofech in shchina, and I say, if something bothers you, let it go, forget about it. Don't let it torment you.
Okay, well, that's what it's suggesting. When you either read it, suppress, avoid being obsessed with it, because when you become obsessed with it, you, first of all, you make yourself the center of everything, and you forget about everything else. And for your own sake, that's not good, because you just feel lost. And if ignoring, pretty much the same, but you're letting, by ignoring it, you're saying, I'm not going to let this define me. I want to focus on the positive. Now, there is a debate in the Talmud, if we look at 5, between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. One said he should forcefully push it out of his mind. One who worries should banish his concerns from his thoughts. And one said it means he should tell Yisichena others his concerns, which will lower his anxiety. So, would you like to share when, not necessarily talking about yourselves, but when do you think, and of course there are different types and different levels of anxiety, but when is it good to try to suppress it? Is it ever good to try to suppress it? Or is it healthier to talk about it? And there are different ways you can talk about it. You know, we live in an age where going to a therapist is very acceptable. There are some that it's enough for them to talk about it with a friend.
But Bracha, doesn't it depend on the problem? Some problems, you feel better or you get a better outlook if you talk about it. Some cases, there's nothing you can do about it. So I think that both at the point, it depends on the problem.
Bracha, I would go with the second option about talking it out. And I think that's where the whole growth of cognitive therapy has come into play, because dealing with it and confronting it and you know, making sure if a person keeps pushing down these anxieties or these, I'll put it into another word, into these fears, they have a tendency to come out in a different way. And whether it's physical, and we know of those people, of all of those people who walk around with gut aches because of something that they're suppressing, we don't do ourselves a favor by continually suppressing things that are making us anxious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, Bracha,
Julianne.
I think it's unrealistic to say, oh, just suppress it, just push it aside, because realistically, when we have things that are bothering us, even when you're sleeping, your mind keeps going over and over and trying to find a solution, or it just keeps going over and eating away inside at you. So I agree partially with Marlene, but partially also with the idea of a therapist, in that they know how to help you to deal with it and be able to find another way of looking at it so that it doesn't eat away at you and you can grow beyond it.
Yeah. Well, this Dr. Twersky, I said his focus was on people with addictions, and that was him trying to get them to stop, whether it was drugs or alcohol, and be able to talk about it. And
But
yeah.
you know,
Well, Bracha, I just read a book by a man called Michael Singer, and it's called The Surrender Experiment. And he's a man who sought help through meditation and so on. But it's his point is that maybe he would say life or a life force, and you would, or another would say God. But his point is that one needs to give oneself over. You can't control things, but you need to be open to going where life takes you. And so some would say trust in God, and he says trust that the forces of life will help you to get through whatever.
you know,
Yeah. What'd you say the name of the book is?
The Surrender Experiment. And if you read the first few chapters, you'll think, oh, this guy is off the wall. But you actually have to read it right to the end.
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
when my girls were young, I used to tell them there's nothing wrong with venting. Now and then, if something bothers you, vent and get it out instead of letting it eat you up.
Okay. Now, just looking to expose us to different perspectives on this, just briefly, let's look at a few intellectuals going back to Saadia Gaon, 10th century, who said, we must use, and what do you think of this? We must use our intelligence and reason to control anxiety, just as we control our appetites. When there is no legitimate reason for anxiety, no physical or ethical danger, our cognitive faculty should stop our fretting. Now, how realistic is he being? Somebody
He's
said
very
earlier.
unrealistic.
Say that again.
Very
He's
unrealistic.
unrealistic. When he says, for example, just as we control our appetites, there are millions of us on this planet who cannot control our appetites. There are people that are addicts, compulsive overeaters that cannot control their appetites, like an alcoholic.
Yep.
So I guess he wasn't aware of this in his day, obviously. But today, with the knowledge we have, we say, no, this is just not right.
We've talked about this in a different context of just because you might know something or that's the right deed, it doesn't mean you're going to go from that and do that actual deed. Absolutely. With him, Abraham Abulafa said something along the same terms. We should be able to control our thoughts just as a horseman controls his steed, spurring it forward or reining it as he pleases. At all times, the imagination must similarly remain subject to the will, not straying from its authority, even by a hair's breadth. Now, I want to go back to what you just said, Michael. Sometimes these thinkers were talking to people who were similar to Ibn Ezra. Why am I thinking of the commentator Ibn Ezra? Because I don't remember in which chapter, in which book, but he's explaining that when somebody wants to do something that's totally irrational, what he does to stop that is say, it's like a farmer back in the old days who was in love with a princess and he wants her. So how does he take care of his lust? It's enough for him to just say, God didn't want me to have her. So that's the kind of population they could be, people who were able, even though I think you and I both know that even within that group, that didn't necessarily dictate how they behaved. Just some thoughts. Now, one of the most interesting, music therapy. In the Tanakh, in the book of Samuel, when Shaul is the king, whenever the evil spirit of God came upon Shaul, David, you remember him in those days, would take the lyre and play it. Saul would find relief and feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. There are several examples in the Tanakh where it is obvious that music is looked upon as something that is very emotive, whether it's for happiness or sadness. And Yaakov Yitzchak of Lublin in the 18th century went as far as to say the Lord becomes attentive to the man who sings in the midst of his troubles. Now, before I scroll down, what is something that particularly the Hasidim gave us that has that ability to take us onto a different level?
Well, the method of the Baal Shem Tov is that you worship God through love, not through fear.
Okay, but if we're talking about music,
So all the singing, you sing on Shabbat, they constantly sing. You go to Hasidic service, and there is so much singing. You go to Friday night at the Hasidic home. It's a
what's the word I'm looking for, people?
Nigun,
The
nigun.
nigun. The nigun. Eastern Europe, Hasidim, gave us the nigun to elevate the soul. Now, it doesn't just have a binug, but these were, if not consciously, these were strategies. The music, Rambam, an intellectual, he writes and advises that listening to music, taking walks in beautiful gardens, looking at beautiful buildings and sculptures, Rambam says, is a way of taking away anxiety. These aren't just with the mindfulness modern day theories. Just a few thoughts about anxiety.
At Bracha, I'm going
Yes.
back to the Gaon, and I'm thinking of Bertrand Russell, who makes a big difference between common sense and intelligence. As a matter of fact, he goes so far as to say that there is nothing more irritating to intellectual when the common man makes more sense than he does.
Well, sometimes it is just common sense, and you don't need to be an academic to understand something. But the question is, now, for different people, obviously, there's a different strategy. For one, it might be music. Another, it might be dance. Another, it might be sculpting, whatever it is. Another would be to studying Torah. There's a lot written about that and those kinds of activities. Now, I'd like to make the transition now to anger through a text written by, I'm not sure if this will sound familiar to you. Do you know the name Soraya Hamali? She wrote this book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. We could talk about that. Is women's anger stronger than man's? Nobody's speaking. Okay, all right. Well, she's a writer, and in 2018, actually was voted by the Washington Post and some other esteemed as quite a writer. Anyway, she writes much about gender and abuse, and she says the following, which will take us into anger.
By the way,
An inability to articulate anger is recognized as a significant component of anxiety and depression. Now, somebody said that earlier. Obviously, thinking about anger, being angry, or writing about anger will not eliminate pain, illness, discrimination, or death. Neither will hostile lashing out, behavior that often alienates others. However, expressing anger in specific ways measurably reduces the pain that chronic sufferers experience and improves mortality rates. Research has shown that a person's degree of expressed anger singularly explains the success of pain mitigating interventions. People who articulate their emotions and in a way that makes meaning out of strong feelings of anger and resentment are better able to adjust to pain. In particular, research has found that writing about emotions in a way that makes sense of them can result in improvements in pain relief. Similarly, by the way, there's the science of happiness, and I've seen some research and videos on this research where people expressing gratitude actually writing a letter with a pen, actually, or calling someone to thank is also meant to be very, very healthy. So whether it's expressing anger in a controlled way or gratitude or happiness, expression, very, very important. Now, it's puzzling if you think about it, that anger, which is and can be so destructive, if you think about it,
Good stuff.
it's not the subject of a direct commandment. There is no mitzvah that says they shall not be angry. We have a pasuk that says don't hate somebody in your heart, and you should criticize. Talk about that at another time. But it's strange. It's something that causes so much destruction. Well, Chaim Vital of the 16th century explains why. Before we ever get to the point of performing mitzvot, there is a need to develop our basic character. Follow this. The traits that comprise our character determine the way in which we will fulfill the mitzvot. We must spend our energy in perfecting these aspects of ourselves. Once these are properly developed, we can perform the mitzvot with relative ease. Overcoming anger, says Vital, is a foundation for the proper fulfillment of the entire Torah and is therefore not counted as a separate mitzvah. Now, what's behind his thinking? Why, if somebody is angry, whether for a bit or overall, why is that person not really going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah?
Because doesn't mitzvah require the word midah, that you measure, that you weigh the situation? And
So what does that have to do with being angry?
No, so you look at your anger and you kind of measure it. First of all, you ask the question, is the person who caused me anger meant to do it or didn't mean to do it? That already puts it in two different categories. Then am I angry? It's something that is that important. It's really going to change my life. So once you wait and think about it, very often it reduces the size of the anger, and then you're more able to do the mitzvah.
Okay, in other words, I would add to that a person who was so self-absorbed, perhaps even arrogant enough to be angry, would not be open to mitzvot. In truth, what he's saying is somebody who is angry, again, is self-centered and is not really going to be open to a fellow human being and certainly not to God. That's what he's trying to say here. Now, look at this next text. In the Talmud, it says, the ancient sages said, those who are angry, it is the same as if they worshiped idols. Why the comparison? What does being angry have to do with worshiping idols? And it's connected with what I just said briefly. Anyone? And obviously, worshiping idols was considered something terrible. Because anybody want to? It doesn't just say that it's a terrible thing if you're angry, but it compares it to worshiping idols.
Because you put your anger before everything else.
Okay, that's one reason.
Bracha, I have a problem with that. I think it depends on what you're angry about. You can be angry at injustice,
Ah,
and that's a different story.
we're
as
going to
being-
get there, Marlene. Have faith. We are going to get there. Put that on hold. We are definitely going to get there. So we're now talking about destructive anger. Okay? Hold on to your thoughts, Marlene. So an angry person becomes a slave to his or her evil instinct and is no longer in control. The fury controls him or her. The brain becomes powerless, and you let it rule over you. Now, you don't necessarily invite that in, and you don't have control. But that's what makes it so difficult. And he suggests that there are a few questions we should always be asking ourselves when we do get angry. Is my anger hurting me? Is my anger hurting others? Is my anger justified, or is it really misplaced? Is my anger protecting me or others from real harm? And finally, is my anger being expressed in a productive, reasonable way? Now, the Pirkei Avot suggests there are 4 types of temperaments amongst us. And notice if you notice something in particular here. There are 4 types of temperaments. One who is easily angered, but easily appeased.
Mhm.
His virtue cancels his flaw. Then there is one whom it is difficult to anger and difficult to appease. His flaw cancels his virtue. One, the third, whom it is difficult to anger and is easily appeased, is a chassid. Now, it doesn't mean the chassid we were talking about with the nigun. A good person. One who is easily angered and is difficult to appease is wicked. Now, what do you notice here? It does not give a 5th option. There's no option of a person who never gets angry, because that just doesn't exist. Now, you're right. There are different types of anger, and stronger, less, and of course, depending on the situation. Obviously. Now, even Moshe Rabbeinu, and we know this, was a human being, and he would get angry. Now, let's follow this. In Shmot, it came to pass, as soon as he came unto the camp, when he comes down from Har Sinai, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moshe's anger waxed hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them beneath the mount. Okay, you know that in Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, which is called Mishneh Torah, Moshe repeats much of what's happened previously. Now notice his repetition of this episode. I started down the mountain, a mountain ablaze with fire, the 2 tablets of the covenant in my 2 hands. I saw how you had sinned against your God. You had made yourselves a molten calf. You had been quick to stray from the path. that God had enjoined upon you. Thereupon I gripped the 2 tablets and flung them away with both my hands, smashing them before your eyes. Now, what is the difference between the episode related in Exodus and when he repeats it now in Deuteronomy? There's a subtle difference. Somebody?
In Deuteronomy, Moshe's action is very intentional, and he's using the breaking of the tablets as an object lesson for the people, whereas in Exodus, it's just a result of him being angry.
Beautiful. Okay, you don't hear him refer to his anger, and it's not impulsive the way he describes it. Great. Okay, now,
Bracha.
the commentators are not unanimous on their criticism. And we're going to take a look at that.
Yeah.
But before we do, what do you think about Moshe in this case and in the case when he screams at Bnei Israel in Bamidbar, you rebels, when they're asking once again for water? What do you have to say about Moshe's anger? Anyone?
Well, I think he's had enough. It's not the first time. Because generally, if something let's say somebody would wrong me, I would generally like to think it over by the next day and see if it still bothers me the second time. But with Moshe, it was a repeated. They did wrong and wrong and wrong, and he's only human. So he finally got angry.
Okay, he finally gets angry. Is he allowed to get so angry?
He's human.
He's human, but listen to my question again. He is a leader of a people. Is a leader of a people of whatever community permitted to lose it?
No,
No.
they're not. As a leader, they're not allowed to. And this is probably the main reason he wasn't allowed to go to Israel. He showed he wasn't capable of leading the people at that advanced age and where he was at that time.
Exactly. Now, that doesn't mean that when he hit the rock earlier, because that was with the people still that had been in Egypt, maybe that's what they needed. But now he's speaking to a new generation. And a style is called for that is very different.
I don't agree, but
Okay.
because think of yourself as the mother. I know you love your daughter, but weren't you ever angry at her?
Never. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. Some people assume that I didn't bring a text from the Talmud, but that because it's the people you're close with in your family, that it's okay if you lose your temper. No, it's quite the opposite. You know, you feel they love you and you're there together all the time. There are texts referring to don't think that it's okay just because you are close.
Yeah.
Now, I want us to be able to look at the difference of opinion between Moshe's act. Look what it says here. The Lord said to Moshe, carve 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will inscribe upon the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you shattered. Now, in Hebrew, that's Asher Shibarta. Now, this commentator says the following. What is Asher? It means that, but what's another meaning of Asher? Ashrei, Osher, with an olive? Happy. So, how do some of the rabbis understand when God says Asher Shibarta? You don't see God rebuking Moshe. He says, and from where do we derive that the Holy One, blessed be he, agreed with Moshe's reasoning As it is stated, the first tablets which you broke, Asher Shibarta, and Reish Lakish said, the word Asher is an allusion to the phrase, may your strength be true, Yishar Kochacha, due to the fact that you broke the tablets. So this opinion feels that God was pleased with what Moshe did. Now there's a different interpretation in the Midrash. It is written in Kohelet, do not be fast to anger, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. Who was angry? Moshe. As it is written, Moshe got angry, flung the tablets from his hands. This bold and audacious Midrash quotes the verse about fools getting angry and applies it to Moshe. Being fast to anger is the quality of fools, and it leads to foolish behavior. That is impulsive and ill-considered, which is what this Midrash thinks shattering the tablets was. Better would have been to calmly evaluate the situation and then decide on appropriate action. But he's human, and in the heat of that moment, especially powerful is the continuation of the Midrash where God does rebuke Moshe. God said to him, so Moshe, you are calming your anger by destroying the tablets of the covenant? Do you want me to calm my anger by destroying things? Do you not see that the world would not last even 1 hour were I to do so? Moshe said to God, what should I do? And God said, you need to pay a penalty. You shatter them, you replace them, thus sculpt 2 stone tablets. Now, you bring these texts because clearly with emotions and many things, it is not black and white. God had to make a decision at one point that it was time for Joshua to take over. Now, I'd like us to look at another example of anger and another cause of anger. We go back to Rachel that we mentioned last week in a different context. Rachel saw that she had not borne any children to Yaakov, and Rachel envied her sister, and she said to Yaakov, give me children, and if not, I am dead. Look how Yaakov responds. Jacob became angry with Rachel, and he said, am I instead of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? What do you think of Yaakov's response to her? And in the Hebrew, it's even stronger.
There was no
Vayichar
compassion.
Av. Michael?
It's understandable because he's very frustrated. It's not up to him. It's God that's withholding the children. So I get it. It would have been nicer if he could say, sweetheart, it's not me, like he could, if he could be more calm, but I could understand the frustration because he also wanted to have kids with Rachel, but it's not up to him.
Yeah, but to me, it doesn't show compassion.
Okay, all right. But Michael is saying that it's understandable. He's in this familial situation, perhaps not necessarily on the level of Moshe. Now, let's compare this though with Yosef and how he reacts when something similar is said to him. Now, Yosef's brothers saw that their father had died, and they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and return to us all the evil that we did to him. So they commanded messengers to go to Yosef to say, your father commanded us before his death, saying, so shall you say to Yosef, please forgive now your brother's transgression and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Yosef wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also went and fell before him, and they said, behold, we are your slaves. But Yosef said to them, don't be afraid, for am I instead of God? Indeed, you intended evil against me, but God designed it for good, in order to bring about what is at present to keep a great populace alive. What is the difference between Yosef's reaction? He knows that they concocted this story about Yaakov saying, please forgive your brothers. And even though he believes that it's concocted, he listens to their feelings, not just their words. And he is able, unlike Yaakov, to react with sympathy. Now, I want to ask you though, now that I've criticized Yaakov, who else said to Yaakov, if you don't give me this, I'm going to die? Earlier on in life.
Isa?
Asa, exactly. And so some suggest that what really happened to Yaakov, as can often happen, misplaced anger, is when he heard Rachel, who he loved, say that, he heard an echo of what Esau had said to him years ago, and that set him off. In other words, we have stories in the Tanakh that indicate to us different causes for anger. Now,
but in Joseph's case, I think it's not because of, but in spite of the concocted story, that he doesn't show anger to the brothers, because he understood immediately that they concocted that story about their father because of fear of him.
No, absolutely. Despite the fact that he understood that there's no way that that was true, he was sympathetic. He was sympathetic. Now, just a little bit more. The Orchot Tzadikim was a 15th century Jewish ethics text, and the author chose to be anonymous. And he says the following: the angry man cannot be very wise, for wrath causes reason to flee from the mind, which is why a few times in the Tanakh it says that a prophet could no longer function because he was so angry and reason departed from him. I'm skipping a few lines. The angry man bars from himself all corrections and rebukes. This is another flaw of an angry person. You're not willing to listen to anybody else. For no man feels free to reveal his errors and his shortcomings, inasmuch as every man fears him, fears to tell him the things he does wrong, lest he be wrathful with him. And even if some person should rebuke him, the angry man will not receive correction because of his anger. In general, then, an angry man does not acquire any good quality unless he removes his anger from his heart. Now, I want to go down. Who can complete this for me? Anger plus ends up bringing upon us justice.
I don't see it.
Here I have. Anger plus blank equals justice.
Oh,
Anybody?
Yes, me. Forgiveness.
Interesting, Sarah.
Action. Action.
No,
Okay.
righteousness.
Okay. Anybody else? One more?
Perhaps mercy.
Okay. Abraham Joshua Heschel says anger plus love. I told you, Marlene, we'd get to this. Now, we've been talking about destructive anger. Heschel says the following: divine anger is not the antithesis of love, but its counterpart, a help to justice as demanded by true love. You raised the issue of getting angry with a child before. When you do that, it's out of love. That should be the only reason, because you want to be constructive.
correct.
And he goes on to say, is it a sign of cruelty that God's anger is aroused when the rights of the poor are violated, when widows and orphans are oppressed, That's a reason to get angry. That's a reason. Anger, he warns, though, is something that comes dangerously close to evil, yet it is wrong to identify it with evil. Like fire, it may be a blessing as well as a fatal thing. Reprehensible when associated with malice, morally necessary as resistance to malice. Anger may touch off deadly explosives, while the complete absence of anger stultifies moral sensibility. So, what Heschel is saying, there is a difference between an anger of spite and recklessness and anger that is righteous indignation. And he refers to the destructive as being self-absorbed. That person makes him or herself the primary victim, and that's destructive, as opposed to what he calls holy anger, which purifies. A Rabbi Abe Friedman had a great line: if you are not angry about something in this world, you are not paying attention. Now, our time is up. I'm going to save, because I don't want to rush through it. I wanted to give you two models, and it will fit in with next week, of people we're familiar with, very familiar with, Hillel and Eliyahu, and how they dealt with anger. You might be surprised by one. Sometimes the Torah and the Talmud give us models that are either ways that we should imitate or ways that we shouldn't. But we'll leave that for next time. And I would say, I want to close with a thought from Rav Nachman of Bratslav. We referred to him last week. Rabbi Nachman. The world we live in is a very scary place. And he said, if you look over the side of a narrow bridge, you lose your heart sometimes, your courage to continue. It's so narrow. And you freeze up or you sit down. And our lives are this way as well. But what does Nachman of Bratslav urge us to do? What song are we familiar with? Right? The narrow bridge. Kol ha'olam gesher tsar ma'od. The whole world is a narrow bridge. Aval ha'ikar lo lefached klal. But you can't be afraid. Now, based on what a couple of people said earlier, that sounds, terrific. But we sing this, and when we sing it, it does something to us. For sure. Anyway, this is anxiety and anger. We've taken care of that. No need for therapist, etc. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you said anger can be for good and for bad. Thing with jealousy. Jealousy can be for good and for bad, because it can inspire you to, like, competition is a good thing. So for me, I see the similarity between the two.
Yeah, you're right. If we didn't have the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, many things would not get done, actually. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so.
Bracha, there is a program called England Got Talent. And if you do well, Simon goes like this. So thank you for today.
My pleasure. Yes. Okay. So we've learned 3 things about you today, or at least 2. You play cards, you don't care what happens to your car, and you watch Simon Cowell. They've got good entertainment. Okay. Everybody,
Yeah. Since
seeing
COVID,
you. Have a
Yeah.
wonderful week. Shabbat
Have a good
shalom.
day.
Oh, and Chodesh Tov. It's
Chodesh
Rosh
Tov.
Chodesh.
Chodesh Tov, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
That's
Thank you, Bracha.
Thank you.
My
Shabbat
pleasure.
shalom.